They laughed at the black courier, unaware he already held their fate in his grasp. Darius Raines turned their contempt into a weapon, poised to shatter their world. At the end of the story, leave your opinion below, and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll continue. Darius Raines had carved out nearly a decade delivering packages across the tangled streets of Starcrest, his dark skin glistening under the city's relentless sun. His uniform, frayed at the edges from years of wear, branded him as just another courier in the eyes of downtown's elite. At Lux Vision, a towering ad agency with mirrored walls and minimalist decor, he was less than a shadow, just a black man in a blue collar. The lobby sparkled with cold elegance, its marble floors reflecting the disdain of those who worked above him. Most days the receptionist Tara, a pale woman with a tight bun, scribbled her name on his tablet without so much as a glance his way. Darius had grown accustomed to the invisibility, finding quiet dignity in mastering his routes despite their indifference. That morning, as he slid a package onto the counter, a voice sliced through the polished silence with venomous clarity. "Bet this guy thinks he's management material, straight out of the ghetto," sneered Victor Hensley, a senior creative director whose tailored suit screamed privilege. Laughter erupted from a knot of employees near the espresso machine, their eyes darting to Darius with a mix of amusement and contempt. He kept his face neutral, handing Tara the tablet as her pen scratched the screen, but his stomach tightened under the weight of their stares. She returned it without a word, her dismissal as practiced as the racism baked into their chuckles. Victor leaned closer to his audience, his voice rising to ensure Darius couldn't miss it. "Probably spent his life hauling trash. Thinks that's a resume for this place," he said, sparking another wave of snickers that echoed off the glass walls. Darius felt the sting of their words coil around his chest, a familiar burn fueled by years of sidelong glances and whispered slurs. He'd faced it before, shopkeepers who followed him like a thief, clients who assumed he couldn't speak their language, but this hit harder. The laughter wasn't just about his job. It was about his skin, his existence, a reminder that to them, he'd never be more than a stereotype in a uniform. Outside, the Starcrest heat pressed down, the city's gleaming towers casting long shadows over his van. Darius climbed inside, the worn seat groaning as he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached. He wasn't invisible. They saw him enough to mock him, to paint him as less than human because of his race. For years, he'd swallowed the slights, telling himself his work ethic could outshine their prejudice, that his pride could shield him from their hate. But as he sat there, the engine humming beneath him, Victor's words replayed like a taunt, igniting a fire he hadn't known he'd been nursing. They didn't just underestimate him, they despised him, assumed his blackness locked him into a box they'd never let him escape. Darius exhaled sharply, staring at his reflection in the windshield, the uniform they mocked clinging to his frame. They thought they had him pegged, thought his color defined his worth. They were dead wrong, and he'd make damn sure they paid for that mistake. Darius Raines drove away from the Lux Vision Tower, the Starcrest skyline blurring as his mind churned with Victor Hensley's venomous words. The laughter of those privileged suits echoed in his ears, each chuckle laced with the assumption that his black skin doomed him to servitude. He'd spent years shrugging off the sideways looks from strangers, the muttered comments about a place in their world, but this felt different, raw, personal, a wound that refused to clot. His van rattled over the uneven streets, the faded logo, on its side a badge of the life they mocked him for living. By the time he parked outside his cramped apartment in Crestwood, a gritty neighborhood far from downtown's gleam, the sun had dipped below the horizon. Inside, the dim light of a single lamp illuminated the worn furniture, a stark reminder of the gap between him and Lux Vision's elite. Darius dropped onto the couch, his uniform still clinging to him, the weight of the day pressing down like a physical force. He grabbed his phone and dialed his older sister, Lena Raines, the one person who'd always seen through the world's bullshit to the man beneath. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm but edged with concern as she sensed something off in his silence. "Hey, Darius, what's eating you tonight? Don't tell me it's nothing. I hear it in your breathing," she said, cutting through his hesitation with her usual sharpness. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple as he recounted the scene at Lux Vision with painful clarity. "They laughed at me, Lena, called me trash, said a black guy like me couldn't lead," he told her, the words tasting bitter as they left his mouth. Lena stayed quiet for a moment, letting the weight of his hurt settle before responding with a fire that matched his own. "Those assholes don't know you. They see your skin and think that's your story, she said, her tone fierce enough to cut through his doubt. She reminded him of the times he'd outsmarted the odds, the deals he'd struck that no one saw coming, proving he was more than their stereotypes. Darius leaned back, staring at the cracked ceiling as her words sank into his bones like fuel on a smoldering ember. "They're so damn sure I'm nothing. Sure my race keeps me down, no matter what I do," he said, his voice hardening with each syllable. Lena didn't flinch, didn't soften her stance, instead pushing him toward the edge he was teetering on. "Then use that, Darius. Let their ignorance be the rope they hang themselves with," she urged, her belief in him a lifeline he hadn't realized he needed. He nodded to himself, the fire in his chest flaring brighter, no longer just pain but purpose, a vow to turn their racism into his weapon. Darius Raines sat in his cramped Crestwood apartment, staring at the stack of delivery receipts piled from his daily shift. Lena's words still rang in his ears, fanning the flames ignited by the humiliation at Lux Vision earlier that day. He knew those white-collar types in their pricey suits saw him as nothing but a black guy in a uniform, incapable of rising above their assumptions. Their racist jabs that he was fit only to haul boxes weren't just insults, they were a gauntlet thrown at his feet. Darius clenched his fists, recalling Victor Hensley's smirk, so sure that Darius's skin color sealed his fate forever. But they didn't know what he knew. Behind the courier's mask lay a mind sharp as a razor's edge. Over the years, Darius had quietly built something far beyond a delivery career, thriving in the shadows of their prejudice. He'd studied markets, dissected deals, turned small sums into serious cash through savvy investments and quick moves. While others saw only his worn uniform and calloused hands, he spotted opportunities they missed in their blind arrogance. Recently, he crafted a plan that could flip the game entirely, a proposal already catching the eye of shadowy players in Starcrest. These folks didn't care about his race or past, they cared about numbers and results, which Darius delivered in spades. Darius stood, pacing the room, his footsteps echoing in the stillness as he plotted his next move against Lux Vision. He knew the firm was sinking, clients bailing, debts piling up, their white managers too smug to see the cracks forming beneath them. Their confidence in their superiority, fueled by racism, blinded them to the reality Darius saw clearer than anyone else. He decided it was time to shed the uniform they wielded as proof of his worthlessness. Instead of remaining the butt of their jokes, he'd become the one making them regret every word they'd ever hurled his way. His gaze landed on the laptop atop the table, holding his calculations and drafts for taking over Lux Vision. He opened it, scrolled through spreadsheets detailing the firm's weaknesses, and smiled, feeling control for the first time that day. They thought his place was at the bottom, that his black skin chained him to their stereotypes forever, but he was ready to prove them wrong. Darius wasn't about to walk away or forget. He was going to seize their company and reshape it in his image. It would take time, but he was patient, knowing their racism would be their downfall, and his intellect would be his triumph. Darius Raines stepped into the dimly lit lounge of a private club in downtown Starcrest, feeling eyes snag on his weathered jacket. Here, amid leather armchairs and muted lighting, gathered people whose wallets dictated the fates of companies like Lux Vision. He'd been summoned by Marcus Vane, a powerful investor whose tech empire reputation matched his ruthless deal-making. Darius knew men like Vane typically saw guys like him, black and blue collar, as hired help, not equals. But he wasn't here to beg. He was here to take, armed with a plan that could upend their world. Marcus sat in the corner, sipping whiskey, his icy gaze sizing Darius up from head to toe, testing preconceived notions. "You don't look like someone who can pull Lux Vision out of the gutter," he said, his voice cutting through with a faint edge of disbelief. Darius swallowed a surge of anger, recognizing the racism veiled beneath that comment, more than just doubt in his skills. He took a seat across from Vane, sliding a folder of figures onto the table, meeting the investor's stare with unshakable resolve. "Judge me by what I've brought, not by what you think you see," he replied, his words a direct challenge to their biases. Vane flipped through the pages, his brows climbing higher as he digested Darius's breakdown of Lux Vision's vulnerabilities. The firm was bleeding clients due to the arrogance of its white leadership, whose belief in their supremacy blinded them to their looming collapse. Darius laid out how their racist disdain for people like him had left them exposed, and how he intended to turn it against them. "They think I'm nothing because I'm black, but I see what they can't," he said, his voice steady, leaving no room for doubt. Vane leaned back, tapping his fingers on the table, his skepticism slowly giving way to intrigue. After an hour of discussion, Marcus pulled a check from his jacket's inner pocket and slid it to Darius with a faint smirk. "You've changed my mind, Rains. This isn't what I expected from you," he said, admitting his initial prejudice had been misplaced. Darius took the check, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This was the first move to make Lux Vision pay. He knew the firm's white managers, who'd laughed at him, would never suspect a black courier could become their reckoning. Their racism had handed him an edge, and now he held the power to shatter their delusions. Darius Rains spent weeks after meeting Marcus Vane, quietly gathering weapons against Lux Vision in the form of its own shares. He knew the firm was crumbling, clients fleeing, debts mounting, its white bosses still clinging to delusions of superiority. Their racism, which pegged him as just a courier, became his greatest edge in this high-stakes game. He met shareholders under cover of night, ex-partners and small-time investors panicking over the company's decline. These men, mostly white and clad in expensive suits, eyed him warily, their gazes screaming distrust of a black man with a plan. The first meeting unfolded in a smoky cafe on Starcrest's outskirts, where shareholder Howard Klein fidgeted with his tie nervously. "You honestly think you can buy my shares and save this firm?" he asked, his tone dripping with arrogance and thinly veiled racism. Darius smiled, sliding an offer across the table, numbers speaking louder than their biases ever could. He detailed how Lux Vision was sinking under its leadership's incompetence, too proud to admit their failures. Klein hesitated, but Marcus Vane's money and Darius's precise calculations broke his resistance, and he signed the papers. Over the following weeks, Darius repeated this dance with other shareholders, each underestimating him because of his skin color. They assumed he didn't grasp business, that his place was fetching their coffee, not rewriting their destinies. But he exploited their blindness, their certainty that a black man couldn't pose a threat, to snap up shares one by one. At Lux Vision's office, whispers of trouble, layoffs, cutbacks began swirling, yet no one tied it to the courier they barely noticed. Their racism left them careless, and Darius relished the thought that they'd handed him the keys to their ruin. By month's end, he held a controlling stake, sitting in his apartment overlooking Starcrest's glittering lights. His fingers traced the documents proving he now owned the firm that despised him for his race. He recalled Victor Hensley's taunts, his smug belief that Darius would never rise above his uniform. Their arrogance, fueled by racism, had blinded them while he quietly built an empire under their noses. Darius knew the next move was to claim his victory openly, and he savored the anticipation of watching their faces drain of color in shock. Darius Rains strode into the Lux Vision office in Starcrest that morning, carrying a folder set to upend their world. He'd shed the courier uniform for a sharp suit, yet the employees' stares still screamed racism loud and clear. They were used to seeing him as a black guy with packages, not a threat to their glass tower of arrogance. Darius headed straight for the CEO's office, where Richard Thorne reigned, a man propped up too long by white skin and old connections. His secretary, Emily, raised her brows at Darius without his scanner, her confusion tinged with distrust of his presence. "I need to see Thorne now. It's not a request, it's a demand," Darius said, his voice cutting through with icy certainty. Emily hesitated, her eyes raking over him, as if wondering how a black courier dared demand anything at all. She knocked on the office door, announcing the odd visitor, and soon Darius stepped inside, meeting Thorne's dismissive sneer head-on. Thorne sat behind a massive desk, not bothering to stand, his face a mix of irritation and mockery at Darius's audacity. "What do you want, kid? Lost your way with another delivery?" He snapped, his words dripping with racism he didn't even try to mask. Darius set the folder on the desk, flipping it open to pages proving his ownership of Lux Vision. "As of this morning, I own this company, and you're no longer the director," he said, watching Thorne's face blanch with shock and disbelief. Thorne snatched the papers, skimming them, his hands trembling as he searched for any flaw in the numbers. "This can't be. You, a black delivery guy, bought my firm?" "Absolute nonsense," he muttered, his racist astonishment only fueling Darius's triumph. Darius crossed his arms, letting the silence amplify the blow he dealt their delusions. "You've got until the end of the day to clear out this office," Darius continued, his tone leaving no room for debate or pity. Thorne clenched his fists, his face flushing with humiliation, but he found no words to challenge the reality staring him down. Darius turned to the door, tossing over his shoulder, "Maybe look for a delivery gig if you're lucky." He walked out, leaving Thorne stunned, knowing the racism that propped up their confidence had just crumbled under his victory's weight. The office was his now, and he'd make damn sure they all remembered this moment. Darius Raines stood before the glass door of Lux Vision's conference room, ready to confront a crowd that had despised him for years. After ousting Richard Thorne, he'd summoned every employee, aware their racist views wouldn't fade without a fight. He stepped inside, where white faces in pricey suits stared at him with a mix of shock and contempt. They whispered, their glares shouting that a black courier had no right to stand where he stood now. Darius felt their hatred, fueled by the certainty that his skin made him unworthy of their world. "As of this morning, I'm your new owner, and that's no joke," he began, his voice ringing firm, drowning out their quiet discontent. Victor Hensley, the creative director whose taunts had sparked this fire, crossed his arms, smirking with blatant disbelief. "You really think you can run us, delivery boy?" he sneered, his words steeped in racism he didn't bother to disguise. Darius locked eyes with him, letting silence heighten the tension before replying with chilling precision. "I know how you lost clients, Victor. Your racist blindness cost this firm millions," he said, pulling out a folder with hard evidence. The room froze as Darius tossed the documents onto the table, exposing how their arrogance had gutted Lux Vision from within. He explained how their belief in superiority, rooted in skin color, blinded them to mistakes he'd seen every day. "You laughed at me, thinking I'm worthless because of my race," he continued, his words slicing through their delusions like a blade through paper. Some looked away, others squirmed, but Victor straightened, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This place isn't for people like you. You don't belong here," he growled, his racism spilling out unfiltered. Darius stepped forward, his presence filling the room, making them feel the weight of his newfound power. "I'm not here to beg for your approval. I'm here to fix your mess," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. He declared that those unwilling to accept change could leave, pointing to the door with icy calm. Victor clenched his fists, but Darius had already turned to the rest, knowing their racism wouldn't break his resolve. He finished, leaving them in silence, where their biases crashed against the reality of his triumph. Darius Raines stood in Lux Vision's conference room, feeling tension hang heavy after his words, like a brewing storm cloud. The employees stared at him with a mix of fear and hatred, their racist glares clinging to the illusion of their old world. Victor Hensley leapt up, his face twisted with rage, as he jabbed a trembling finger at Darius. "You won't make us work under you, we're all walking out," he shouted, expecting the crowd to rally behind him in revolt. Darius braced for their exit, knowing their racism would destroy them before it touched his plans. But then something unexpected unfolded, flipping everything he'd foreseen in this room 6 months earlier. A young employee, Clara Mays, rose from the back, her dark skin standing out among the sea of white faces. "I'm staying. I believe in what you can do with this place," she said, her voice quivering yet brimming with resolve. Silence shattered as more stood, junior designers, janitors, assistants, their faces reflecting hope, not contempt. Darius froze, realizing these were the ones ignored like him, dismissed for their race or status. Victor spun around, his eyes widening in shock as he saw his rebellion crumbling before his own team. "You're betraying us for this guy? He's nobody," he roared, his racism spilling out in a desperate bid to reclaim control. But Clara stepped forward, her gaze sharp as a blade, answering him with a strength that caught him off guard. "He's the one who sees us, while you only saw yourselves and your biases," she said, her words echoing through the room, forcing Victor to falter. One by one, his allies sat, their confidence evaporating under the stares of those they'd underestimated. Darius felt the lump in his throat dissolve, replaced by a warmth he hadn't anticipated in this moment of triumph. He looked at Clara and the others, understanding this wasn't just a win over racism, it was the start of something greater. "You're the ones who'll rebuild this place because you know what it's like to be unseen," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, but holding firm. Victor stormed out, slamming the door, but his exit was mere background to the applause rising from those who stayed. Darius smiled, for the first time in years, feeling his fight had brought not just power, but a family he'd never sought. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you liked the story, please give this video a thumbs up.